Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 7 of series 8. The question for today is the Buddhist idea of non-self a tacit repression of reflective consciousness? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 5, section 4. So today we are discussing Buddhism, and this helps me to explain why I do philosophy at all. It isn't an intellectual exercise. It's because I find human existence to be intensely uncanny and mysterious. And not to examine it ignores the most epic event in the history of the world and perhaps the universe. Yet I approach these ideas not only through philosophy, but also through religion as mythology. I do this because God is the believer's highest value, and religion is a rich repository of values. In this respect, this evening I want to look critically at Buddhist answers to life and its concept of mind, bearing in mind that Buddhism finds itself halfway between philosophy and religion. More specifically, I'll be looking at three main areas of Buddhist thought or philosophy. These are concepts of mind and the non-self, detachment, suffering and happiness, and attitudes to the vicissitudes of life. On a personal level, one question I share with Buddhism is how to live in the world without negativity and resentment. Several different answers can be suggested. 1. The Buddhist teaching of non-attachment, or the Christian teaching of forgiveness. 2. The psychological task of working through the unconscious causes of resentment. And 3. My preference is a reinterpretation of the offence and magnanimity and appropriate self-esteem and self-value. Yet before mounting a critique of Buddhism, we should first note some of its strengths and advantages. Among its strengths is the undeniable achievement of Buddhist peace and contentment. Then there are practical achievements that come from discipline and focus. There are also theoretical advantages in the Buddhist religious and moral outlook. A central defining feature of religion is the existence of God, but Buddhism has an ambiguous attitude to the existence of God. And one, this is an advantage to the philosophically minded who see the idea of God as problematic. And 2, consistent with the modern moral outlook, postmodernism and Aristotelian ethics, Buddhism isn't moralistic. That is, the Buddhist account of right and wrong is a practical matter with just good or bad consequences. And 3, Buddhist teleology may also be more coherent than Jewish, Christian or Muslim outcomes. On a Christian view, people go to heaven or hell for eternity to suffer terribly or be in paradise. This black and white view is regarded by many as unjust, lacking understanding and even ridiculous. But the Buddhist alternative of reincarnation based on previous lives is regarded as implausible by many. Yet it is at least more morally coherent than eternal consequences on dubious moral judgments. 4. There is also a tradition of skepticism and rational thought in Buddhism which asks for evidence rather than faith. Rationality is a feature of early Buddhist thought, and this is especially the case in Theravada Buddhism. But I should first outline some well-known criticisms of Buddhist teaching that I also share. Firstly, one of its major objectives is the avoidance of suffering and the advancement of happiness. But suffering can be embraced as worthwhile by the athlete, by the lover, by the hero, and by Nietzsche. And suffering need not only be embraced, but it can be an essential part of happiness. That is, negative experience may be a necessary contrast to positive experience. Secondly, happiness has also been criticized in utilitarianism as a limited human objective. That is, happiness neglects what we can call more refined human objectives, such as morals, meaning, purpose, aesthetics, and other human values. Thirdly, I also find Buddhist teaching on the cause and resolution of suffering unrealistic and even mistaken. We should note here the four noble truths of Buddhism, and these are 1. The truth of suffering, 2. The origin of suffering, 3. The cessation of suffering, and 4. The true way to the cessation of suffering. So I'd first like to note that Buddhism seems to be fixated on and restricted to the idea of suffering. And suffering is said to be caused by attachment, resolved by giving up this attachment. But suffering is obviously caused by a lot of other things other than attachment. So it seems that this teaching is plainly mistaken, supported largely by religious dogma. And to equivocate between real and illusory suffering is theological sophistry. Buddhist and Eastern religion are also challenged by Western psychology and philosophy. In psychology, an adverse reaction indicates an unconscious perturbation requiring resolution. Buddhism regards such as passing emotions of an illusory self that we should ignore. But the idea of adverse experience as illusory requires justification as well as being against common sense. It also undermines our experience of the world as meaningful. Slavoj Žižek makes a similar criticism of Buddhist thought in an unexpected contrast with Christianity. Žižek speaks of the dark core of Christianity that engages authentically with finitude and death. Conversely, he sees Eastern religion as evading life's negativities in detachment and indifference. And as I will shortly outline, other aspects of life that Buddhism seems to evade. Yet a stronger criticism of Buddhist detachment is that it is not just evasive but incoherent. This criticism builds on the problem that detachment reduces meaningful engagement with the world. One solution would be to differentiate between events that are worthy and unworthy of engagement. That is detachment from negative events like loss and deception, but engagement with positive things. But this isn't the principle of detachment. It's a detachment from the negative and engagement with the positive. Yet this requires a further principle to differentiate between the positive and negative. But this further principle is not only unstated, but is also unformulable. It's unformulable because of the relative desirability or undesirability of objects and events. And the strategy of just choosing which events are positive or negative isn't typically available to the Buddhist. This is because ideally the Buddhist doesn't discriminate. He is detached from all worldly events. This can be described as a form of value monism, of which Nietzsche has been accused. But my foremost criticism of Buddhism is about the self-obfuscation of my key concept of consciousness. The issue of obfuscation arises from an interpretation of the central Buddhist teaching of non-self. Yet there are different terms are used here, such as the traditional no-self, the non-self, or the not-self. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that, I quote, Buddhist theories of mind center on the doctrine of the not-self. I myself prefer to use the term the non-self. Questions abound, however, about what the non-self means and its coherence and contradictions. Uncertainty about the meaning of the non-self also leads to various interpretations, at least for the rank and file. For example, one account of the non-self is as the elimination of the ego, which again is subject to misconceptions. It can mean eliminating self-concepts such as I am clever, handsome, rich or strong. But psychologists like Freud and Adler have advocated the idea of a healthy ego. Another aspect of the non-self is the Buddhist rejection of a unified essential self in the doctrine of anatta. That is, the self is only a bundle of states and properties onto which we project the fiction of an enduring self. But the notion of an essential enduring self is subject to considerable criticism in modern thought. The ancient idea of an unchanging essence has been rejected by thinkers from Hume to Sartre. Any personalities, again, change over lifetimes, and in the end, people die. There is no enduring self. Is Buddhism then just restating a modern understanding of mind, but in a more obscure way? Or worse, are muddled ideas being expressed that are based on a mistaken metaphysics? I hope to throw some light on this question shortly. Yet the Buddhist conception of a divided self is also consistent with various ideas like Hume's bundle man, as well as with a post-Renaissance conception of the self as modular and divided. But Buddhism also seems to misleadingly reify or objectify these aspects of mind into metaphysical principles. Yet the idea of the non-self, as well as the divided self, can also find some comparisons in modern thought. Physicalists like Daniel Dennett, for example, hold that somehow consciousness doesn't exist. I agree that somehow consciousness doesn't exist, but somehow consciousness does exist. And we need to differentiate between how it does and doesn't exist, instead of positing a non-self. Sartre is also somewhat ambiguous in describing consciousness as a lack, an absence, or a desire for being. Yet this corresponds with his negative appraisal of consciousness as a fissure within being, and that nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. Such descriptions are both comparable to and developments of a non-self. Yet there are also questions about the validity of the concept of the non-self. One, the above are cursory accounts, but we don't have comprehensive accounts of the non-self in Buddhism, in Sartre, or in psychology. And two, what is the justification of a preference for the non-self over reflective consciousness? Yet conversely, I will argue against a preference for the non-self shortly. The earlier problem of making psychology into metaphysics is illustrated with the Buddhist understanding of mind. Hindu Vedanta and Buddhist theories of mind share significant similarities that we can look at. But one difference is that Vedanta tries to establish an underlying Atman as the basis of everything, whereas Buddhism sees the world as only a stream of passing evanescent processes. It is characterized as anatta, or not having a persistent or independent existence. The differences and similarities between Buddhist and Vedantic conceptions of self have been much debated. Yet the existence of the debate itself points to a shared ancient perspective or metaphysic. And this view is reinforced by the Buddhist teaching of reincarnation. But without a persisting self, along with a non-self, there can be no reincarnation. This indicates contradictions, or certainly problems, in both Buddhist and Vedantic teachings. Another problem is how events judged as negative in one life can have adverse effects in another. Cause and effect is a difficult concept in science, and much more so in spiritual dimensions. Another problem is that on the Vedantic view, there is an absolute consciousness that underlies the whole world. But the question is often asked, how did absolute consciousness become the world of multiplicity and change? Shankaraka answers that absolute consciousness didn't become the world, it only appears so. Yet this seems to be another case of mystification rather than explanation. And we have a similar problem in both Buddhist and Vedantic accounts, that something is the case but not really. I give an example in Zen Buddhism shortly. In Vedanta, we have a contradictory conception of consciousness. That is, it uses the same word for an underlying reality as the experience of human consciousness. That is, there are many properties that can be attributed to human consciousness, but two essential properties are cognition and sentience. Without them, we can't have consciousness. Yet the Vedanta presents a form of absolute consciousness that does not have these properties. So my conclusion is that on Leibniz's law of indiscernibles, as well as on other thinking, these two forms of consciousness cannot legitimately describe the same thing. Yet my central questions about Buddhism mistakenly interpreting a certain aspect of consciousness as the non-self. For instance, non-being has been cited as an essential aspect of being or consciousness by Hegel and Sartre respectively, though in different ways. The self-obfuscating character of consciousness has also been discussed by myself and others in different ways. One of these is that the absence of consciousness is even more difficult to discern than its presence. Another is the New Age view that the self or the ego is undesirable and has to be dispensed with. But the evolutionary and psychological advantages of the self have been well argued. The first requirement for a creature to survive is to distinguish the self from the non-self. In psychology, a healthy ego is also a hallmark of a well-adjusted self. Yet in the 18th century, David Hume famously said, "When I search for myself, I can never find myself as a self. I can never catch myself without a perception, without which I may truly be said not to exist." So Hume seems to think of himself as another object in his field of perception, whereas he is the originator of his field of perception, like an eye that cannot see itself. Similarly, we find surprising evidence that self-consciousness or reflective consciousness is a problem. Paul Paul Ricoeur challenges the cogito as a presumed certainty which can be deceived about itself. Merleau-Ponty writes that it is the essence of consciousness to forget its own phenomena. Husserl and Sartre have also noted the difficulty of consciousness apprehending itself. But requests for arguments or justification for Buddhist teachings as the non-self may seem very un-Buddhist. That is, despite both pragmatic and rationalist traditions in Buddhism, the original Gautama Buddha sought practical answers to suffering and happiness rather than theory, and he reputedly, for example, left his wife and family to seek enlightenment. Yet this is an example of practicality taken to the extreme of neglecting a principle. And this event also illustrates another deficiency of Buddhism, that it neglects issues about value. These are the evaluative issues of morals, meaning, purpose, aesthetics, and other undiscovered values. Although Buddhism may be amoral, the neglect of value is also a typical deficiency of religion. That is, an emphasis is put on salvation without recognizing that its pursuit is a system of meaning. The doctrine of non-self can also be questioned by contrasting Buddhism with Western philosophy and psychology. The Western view seeks the authentic or real self through psychoanalysis or philosophical analysis. But enlightenment in Buddhism is the realization that the self doesn't have any substantial identity. Yet this is endorsed by the Sartrean view that there is no human nature and we create ourselves through our choices. But these Sartrean and Buddhist views of not-self don't accord with other theories or with life experience. Both Sartre and Buddhism have been accused of leaving something out of human experience, and both have ambivalent relations with the physical world. We can see what has been left out by looking more deeply into Buddhist teaching. Like other religions, Buddhism isn't just a meditation, but is an attitude and a way of practicing life. And central to this attitude is the practice of non-self, especially prominent in war and the martial arts. The Japanese Zen Buddhist writer Teitaro Suzuki described this in a wartime commentary. He writes, "When I try to kill some of you, it is not really me, but the sword itself that does the killing. He, the killer, has no desire to do harm to anybody, but the enemy appears and makes himself a victim. It is though the sword performs automatically its function of justice." Unquote. Slavoj Žižek describes this kind of thinking as bullshit. It's the thinking that it's not just that I am the sword, that the sword and I are one, but that I am not myself. And when I kill without mercy or compassion, because it is the sword that kills, without mind. This offers an explanation of the significance of Zen Buddhism in the atrocities of war. The implications of this view is spelt out more explicitly when Suzuki writes, "If I reach nirvana, then I no longer experience myself as an acting agent responsible for the act." These can be read as accounts of the repression of reflective consciousness that enables moral judgment. I now want to explain at least one way of how this can happen. Yet I first want to give examples of how this can happen in sport when we are called in the flow. My experience of this is in the martial art of judo. A well executed move or throw is when you become aware of the throw after it happens. The throw was pre-conscious rather than conscious or reflectively conscious. I want to explain Buddhist non-self, Zen warfare and the flow in sport as a diminished reflective consciousness. My long-standing argument that consciousness has been overlooked and neglected supports this view. Because consciousness is obscure, its significance is liable to be overlooked. And because it can be overlooked, it is easier to repress as undesirable. Self-consciousness cannot be automatically accepted as advantageous in all contexts. It gets in the way of automatic reflexes, uninhibited thought, and distorts action as an inflated ego. And self-consciousness can incur problems like anxiety, alienation, guilt, doubt, and anomie. So the above provide 3 reasons that support the view that Buddhism overlooks or represses self-consciousness. 1. Buddhism is an ancient religion from a time when consciousness was difficult to understand. 2. Buddhist practice points to a neglect or repression of self-consciousness. And 3. Self-consciousness is even more likely to be overlooked than the idea and the experience of consciousness. But writer and Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh seems to contradict this view with an emphasis on mindfulness. He writes, "If we are not fully ourselves, truly in the present moment, we miss everything." But he not only contradicts the view of Buddhism above, but also reality when he writes, "Birth and death are only notions, and that no death, no fear, they are not real." Yet as Thich Nhat Hanh is using words to describe the world, we are entitled to ask, what do they mean? When he says birth and death are not real, he must be speaking metaphorically or metaphysically. And I ask whether this is wisdom or a way of covering up contradictions and confusion. And looking beyond contradictions and confusion, we might find the human traits of repression and self-deception. Slavoj Žižek is merciless in his criticism in this respect. He quotes Suzuki again as saying that it is the very force of compassion which gilts the sword. A true warrior kills out of love. I even have to censor my own quotations by Žižek about Suzuki's support of the Japanese war in China. Suzuki wrote, "They cannot get that the sword, which is killing them now, is really the sword of love." Yet we are speaking about extreme self-deception only made possible by some syndrome that has to be explained. The antidote is thinking for yourself and thinking very hard indeed. In conclusion, we can review some of the real benefits and deficiencies of Buddhism. Buddhism has a tradition of rational thought and peace, as well as for good and bad being an ideology. And in the modern world, its agnostic and amoral inclinations can be regarded as virtues. Buddhism is also more enlightened than many other religions with respect to consciousness. Yet its central concept of the non-self can be seen not only to neglect, but as a repression of consciousness. Now, this is a natural tendency of human consciousness, especially in ancient systems of thought. Yet in extreme forms of Zen Buddhism, we saw this tendency turn into self-deception. Another negative aspect of Buddhism is its unrealistic teaching with respect to attachment, suffering and happiness. Buddhism teaches that attachment to the world is wrong and is the cause of suffering. Certain kinds of attachment are also eschewed by other religious and even philosophical systems. Sartre, for example, advises refraining from appropriating things for their own sake. But it's patently untrue that all suffering can be eliminated by non-attachment. Yet a more subtle failing of neglecting aspects of value is shared by all other religions. In the Buddhist case, though, it comes in a positive package which refrains from moralistic judgments. But this apparent pragmatism also neglects meaning, purpose, other values, and the why of life. These are some of the features that intuitively appeal to some people. And after all, Buddhism is a practical form of religious philosophy. This is both its strength and weakness, offering a system of ideas drawn from the conventions of the time. My objectives have been to highlight what these strengths and weaknesses are. These are also the strengths and weaknesses of other religious systems that we have discussed. These are both the insights and the opacity which religion paradoxically offers. And these are particularly pronounced with respect to the phenomenon of consciousness and value. Buddhism approaches the phenomenon of consciousness with the ideas of self and non-self. But these ideas allude to later discoveries about the character of consciousness. But with respect to value, Buddhism fails to recognize itself as a system of meaning. Next week we'll discuss a more explicit framework of consciousness and value. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.